Quebec's Eastern Townships are haunted by old tales and legends of times past that lurk incomplete or only half remembered in the collective imaginations of families that have lived here for generations. Stories told by parents and grandparents compete for attention with the complex trappings of contemporary life, and more often than not, are lost to memory. But sometimes, if only by chance, an old tale is preserved, taunting us by its paucity of detail to unwrap the riddles of its narrative. I'm Grant Myers from the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, and I am joining you today from the Thompson Cemetery near the forgotten hamlet of New Mexico in the Eastern Townships. This is the reputed burial place of Peggy Green, the Witch of New Mexico Road. Sometime during the 19th century, farmers living in the vicinity of New Mexico Road were dismayed to discover that their cows were no longer giving milk. Guessing that someone or something was stealing the milk, a few of the farmers set a trap and during the night caught a large white hare suckling on their cows. Supernatural forces were clearly at play, and the farmers released the animal, but not before notching its ears. A short time later, an old woman from the community named Peggy Green died, and it was observed at her funeral that the ears were notched in the same way as the captured hare. This confirmed suspicions that all was not as it seemed. A witch had been stealing the milk. Following the death and burial of the old woman, the farmers expected that their cows would start producing again. But this was not the case. Only after they returned to the cemetery and walled in Peggy Green's grave was the offending spell or curse broken, and the cows again began to yield milk. New Mexico, Quebec today is little more than a quiet corner at the intersection of two country roads. In the 1880s, it was a busy agricultural settlement made up of mostly Irish and French Canadian Catholics. New Mexico is still listed and recognized by the Quebec Toponymy Commission. According to the commission, the community's first settlers were from Mexico, Maine, a farming town at the confluence of the Androscoggin and Swift rivers in the western end of the state. They came to Quebec to take advantage of cheap land and abundant forests. The Thompson Cemetery was the Catholic burying ground for the New Mexico settlement. 33 existing and legible headstones in the Thompson Cemetery, with dates ranging from 1873 to 1994, were recorded during a survey conducted in 2005. Without exception, all recorded stones displayed names of either Irish or French Canadian origin. But Peggy Green was not among them. If she is buried in the Thompson Cemetery, her grave is at present unknown. But what can we make of this story? The elements of the Peggy Green legend are clearly well rooted in the folkloric traditions of the British Isles. As early as the 12th century, a chronicler reported that in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, it was believed that certain old hags would steal milk by turning themselves into hares and suckling on the teats of cows. It was suggested at the time that this belief was ancient. The story of a shape-shifting hare is just one of the ancient traditions related to the milk magic of Celtic peoples. Identified by folklorists as the witch as hare motif, the tale conforms to a more or less constant formula. A large hare is caught suckling the cows and identified as the cause of the poor yield. The hare is maimed or injured in the attempt to escape. A short time later, an old dying woman is observed to have the same injury as a hare and thus discovered as a thief. The origins of this story are more ancient still and rooted in the mythology of pre-Christian Europe. Many of the deities of old Europe were reputed to have shape-shifting powers and supernatural references to a variety of animals, among them the hare. The Norse goddess Freya was said to have employed hares as her train-bearers. The Anglo-Saxon fertility goddess Ostera, her veneration sometimes identified as a pagan precursor to the Christian celebration of Easter, was often depicted with hare's ears. Cupid, the Roman god of love, was also sometimes depicted in the company of hares. With the advent of Christianity, the old gods of pagan Europe became the subject of folklore, existing as compelling yet incomplete vestiges of another time. Among the rural people in parts of the British Isles and elsewhere, creatures of myth lived on as denizens of the other world, and though largely unseen, often complicated the fortunes of those living in this world. The panic fears of black magic and Satan worship that gripped much of Europe during the Protestant Reformation, leading to the witch hunts of the early modern era, stood in stark contrast to the worldview of the Celtic peoples living on the western margins of the continent. As John Seymour points out in Irish Witchcraft and Demonology, published in 1913, in Celtic Ireland, dealings with the unseen were not regarded with such abhorrence, and indeed had the sanction of custom and antiquity. While the inhabitants of the other world, such as fairies, ghosts, and witches, were often mischievous and sometimes malevolent and dangerous, they were nevertheless considered part of the natural order. It was this worldview, a thick stew of Catholic faith and pre-Christian belief, that Irish immigrants brought with them to the New World. We can understand the legend of Peggy Green as more than a folktale from a small rural community. Rather, it should be recognized as an element of ancient tradition spanning at least 2 continents and innumerable centuries to become part of the cultural legacy of Quebec's Eastern Townships. Identified by folklore, excuse me, I'll try again.